On June 16, 2015, Donald Trump famously rode down his escalator at Trump Tower to announce his long-shot bid to be President of the United States. The unlikely coalition he was able to build, in spite of widespread predictions it would not hold, included Rust Belt workers and Wall Street donors, culture warriors, and Chamber of Commerce Republicans, groups that weren't exactly historic allies. Yet 10 years on, through a global pandemic and 2 impeachments, he managed to hold it all together. That is until 2025, when things appear to be shifting for the first time. His coalition that defied political gravity for nearly a decade is beginning to show signs of strain. Small business owners who backed Trump were the first to break with him after the aggressive tariff campaign earlier this spring. But there's been more spillover into other areas too. The economy, the cost of living crisis, even immigration. And then there's the Epstein files, which Trump's allies have spent months hyping up even as the president tried to tamp down expectations. But at the time of writing, Congress has just passed by a near unanimous margin a bill aimed at forcing the White House to release them. The real question is whether these cracks represent temporary friction or something more fundamental, the unraveling of a coalition that was fragile to begin with, a coalition that may now be heading into civil war. The coalition. Now, divisions in political parties, they're not exactly a new phenomenon. Even in countries with broad multi-party systems, occasional rifts are known to open up, and in the United States' two-party system, there's inherently going to be a whole load of ideologies inside each party. Republicans, for instance, span from the more moderate politicians like Susan Collins in Maine, who is pro-choice and is consistently ranked as one of the Senate GOP's most bipartisan members, to arch-conservatives like Ted Cruz, along with the ascent of the new right phenomenon, best personified by Vice President J.D. Vance. These new right figures represent the GOP's economically populist wing, who are more skeptical of free trade and corporate influence than the party has been for decades, and more willing to use government intervention to act in ways they argue would protect American workers and industry. And yet, despite these fundamental differences in ideology and approach, they've largely managed to coexist within the same party and advance a common agenda. Democrats, definitely no difference. The party that ultimately nominated Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden to be their standard-bearer has also been going through something akin to an intra-party civil war, with progressive candidates like Senator Bernie Sanders and Democratic Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez leading the charge against more centrist and establishment Democrats. Caught in the crossfire were some of their own moderate members, with former Arizona Senator Kyrsten Sinema and West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin both leaving the party and no longer serving in Congress. But throughout it all, something that has been genuinely impressive has been Donald Trump's ability to not just hold his party together, but actually to expand it. When Mitt Romney ran in 2012, roughly 1 in 10 Republican voters were non-white. By 2024, that figure had doubled to 1 in 5, with Hispanic support overall nearing the 50% mark and surpassing it with Hispanic men. He also brought in young men who had sat out previous elections, all while keeping the party's traditional business wing and evangelical base on board. His first term was particularly successful at delivering to his base's various factions. The 2017 tax cuts pleased the more Wall Street wing of the party and small business owners alike, while frequent interventions in trade negotiations at least gave the impression that he was fighting to keep jobs in America. His far more limited and targeted tariffs on China back in 2018 gave industrial workers something concrete to point to without massively upending global supply chains. The targeted sectors did see price increases, but let's be honest, the fact that aluminium foil went up wasn't going to crash the economy. In politics, perception is reality, and many in the Rust Belt states saw Trump as fighting for them in a way no politician before really ever had. And while the COVID pandemic at the end of his first term upended things considerably, the electorate broadly looked back on the 2019 economy with nostalgia. Polling through 2024 showed that 65% of Americans remembered Trump's pre-COVID years as good, nearly double their rating that they gave to Biden's economy at the time. In fact, the years just before the pandemic hit offer a masterclass in how effective economic growth can be at smoothing over internal party conflicts. Unemployment had fallen to its lowest level in half a century, with Black and Hispanic unemployment levels falling the most dramatically. On top of that, wages were showing some of the most robust growth in years, with weekly earnings for the bottom 25% of earners rising 4.5% year over year, without much inflation to speak of. To top it all off, major stock indexes were breaking records seemingly month after month, and in this economic environment, each faction could plausibly claim victory to some extent, and nobody in the coalition was really left out. They might not have loved everything taking place, but they at least were reaping some of the rewards. Today, Donald Trump is largely the same type of politician he was a decade ago. Some of his stances have changed, and he's been known to occasionally change his opinion on certain issues with impressive speed. But that aside, in the main, people know what they're getting with Trump, for good or for bad. So why is his coalition beginning to show cracks then? Well, because his second term faces a fundamentally different economic environment, one in which answers that worked previously are starting to ring hollow. The fall of discontent. In his second inauguration address back in January, Donald Trump declared, with characteristic modesty, that the, quote, golden age of America begins right now. This declaration came with particular weight given the economic situation he took office in. Inflation had peaked under his predecessor above 9% in 2022. While it moderated in the years that followed, a reduction in inflation is not a reduction of prices. It just means that prices have stopped going up so fast rather than actually coming down. Biden's popularity in the meantime had cratered to such an extent that even Jill was probably muttering, "Let's go, Brandon." Trump was all too eager to seize on this and present himself as the remedy. Fast forward to December 2025, and Americans still seem to be waiting. From the start, Trump rolled out a steadily more aggressive campaign of tariffs, which, depending on the day or who you spoke to in the administration, were variously defended as a negotiation tactic to get other countries to lower their tariffs, or a good in and of itself boost to domestic production and to raise revenues from charging for imports. His so-called Liberation Day in April was the most seismic of them all, raising import duties on countries across the world, including an island that was inhabited exclusively by penguins. While he did ultimately pull back some of these, although the status of those changes on any given day between Trump himself and various court rulings, the most apocalyptic predictions did not come to pass. But the associated price hikes were real. Inflation remains 50% above the Federal Reserve's 2% target, with consumers clearly reporting that they expect prices to continue marching higher. That persistent inflation became the backdrop to what has been a growing issue in the States: the affordability crisis. While government data on inflation, the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, shows 3% inflation, that is merely the average of all prices across the economy, irrespective of how necessary they are. While the reasons behind these measurements aren't nefarious, food and energy prices can swing dramatically for various reasons, making it harder to spot underlying inflation trends. They do create certain blind spots. For the average consumer who's watched the price of a house double, triple, or even quadruple over their lifetime, the fact that flat-screen TVs have fallen in price dramatically is hardly reassuring. For the last several years, consumers have largely been able to scrape by, albeit more narrowly, despite the rising cost of living. Various factors played into this, from leftover savings accumulated during the COVID pandemic to continued government assistance and student loan payments being on pause, but these have largely run out of steam. To be clear, it wasn't just the tariffs, but those didn't exactly help things either. We're seeing the deterioration already. Household debt stress has become increasingly visible throughout 2025, with the New York Fed reporting credit card balances having swelled to $1.3 trillion, while late or missed payments are now at their highest point since 2010. And it extends beyond plastic too. Auto loan defaults have reached 2009 levels and are even higher among younger and subprime borrowers, while personal bankruptcy filings reversed years of declines, jumping 15% year over year. The cost of living crisis is not new, but it does appear to be reaching levels of unsustainability. Trump and most Republican leaders have largely stuck to an upbeat message, insisting that any current economic pain were temporary bumps on the road before the promised prosperity arrived. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent made the rounds on CNBC and Fox Business to argue that the tariff disruptions would be temporary and that 2026 would be a blockbuster year for the economy. But cracks in this once unified front have been forming and can no longer be ignored. Given the populist shift in American politics over the last decade, it's one thing if the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal criticizes the president or something, but quite another when some of his most vocal, longtime supporters are the ones speaking out. And that brings us to Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, who has solidified herself as perhaps being one of the most outspoken of them all in defense of Trump. She literally wore a Trump won mask in the aftermath of the 2020 presidential election on the House floor. Yet as of late, she's been leading the charge in discussing the reality of the economic situation that many, including Republican voters, are suffering. She didn't mince words when she said that despite giving Trump credit for helping to bring down inflation from elevated levels, quote, that doesn't bring prices down, and so gaslighting people and trying to tell them the prices have come down is not helping. It's actually infuriating people. End quote. And this wasn't a one-off, and Green's subsequent interventions span the gamut of cost-adjacent issues, first and foremost among them health insurance. In early October, as the government shutdown dragged on, Green broke in rather dramatic fashion with her party's leadership over the issue. Quote, "When the tax credits expire this year, my own adult children's insurance premiums for 2026 are going to double, along with the wonderful families and hardworking people of my district. Not a single Republican in leadership talked to us about this or has given us a plan to help Americans deal with their health insurance premiums." In an interview with NBC News, she went even further, saying, "What I am upset over is my party has no solution. It's not something that we talk about frequently, but it is a reality for Americans and not something we can just ignore. I really want to fix it." End quote. For what it's worth, she's not wrong. The numbers have been telling a clear story about an affordability crisis in the country across various sectors of the economy, but in particular in housing and healthcare. The average cost of employer-sponsored health insurance for a family has reached just shy of $27,000 per year, which is usually split between employer and employee. Worse still is the individual marketplace, where families buying their own insurance face the full burden without assistance from an employer. Here, premiums have jumped considerably in the last several years, with deductibles often adding another several thousand in out-of-pocket costs annually. For our non-American audience, just know that these are all what experts call a bad thing. Even as this was all bubbling over, the business community also seemed to begin turning on the president. Ken Griffin, the billionaire GOP donor who'd been instrumental in Trump's return to power, went public by declaring that Trump's tariff approach was crony capitalism that picked winners and losers based on political connections rather than economic merit and competitiveness. Even more dramatically, he put millions of dollars behind legal challenges to Trump's use of emergency powers, funding several efforts that questioned whether the president had the authority to unilaterally impose such sweeping tariffs at his discretion. And it wasn't just billionaires. Small business owners, who employ just shy of 50% of Americans, have long represented a core constituency of the GOP and were increasingly finding themselves squeezed between rising costs from tariffs and inability to pass those costs on to cash-strapped consumers. They were also pissed that those with deep pockets and lobbying muscle seemed able to get exemptions to the tariffs while they were stuck soaking up the costs. The Chamber of Commerce, typically a reliable Republican advocacy group, broke with the administration in dramatic fashion, with CEO Susan Clark publicly warning that the tariffs risked pushing the economy into recession and calling for an immediate relief to save small businesses from rising costs and disrupted supply chains. These are the kind of fractures that, in better economic times, might be easy enough to overlook, but not so for the opening fault lines on one of Trump's signature issues: immigration. The immigration wars. Throughout Trump's first term, Republicans had been able to campaign, and in many cases win, on the issue of securing the country's border and reducing the flow of illegal immigrants while sidestepping the issue of legal migration entirely. This strategic ambiguity had worked well for him and his party as a whole. He could deliver aggressive action on illegal migration while delivering a steady inflow of H-1B workers for businesses, keeping both populist voters and business supporters reasonably satisfied. That is, until autumn, when the administration went and blew up its own past support for the program. Back in September, Trump announced a new fee of $100,000 for each new H-1B visa, which initially pleased his base, seeing it as the first step towards finally putting American workers first. Tech companies, for their part, they panicked. The issue has been growing steadily in prominence over the last several months, but burst onto center stage during a Fox News interview when Laura Ingraham pushed him on his stance, saying that, quote, "We have plenty of talented people here." He interrupted in response, saying, "No, you don't. No, you don't," trying to pivot back to needing a sizable number of foreign workers to be allowed to come into the country. After years of pushing America first and hire American, Trump's framing of the situation undermined his credibility, with many who were growing disenchanted with the economy, even those who had long adored his style of politics. For the first time, his abrasive style wasn't directed at those they viewed as rivals or outright enemies, but at his own supporters. And the fallout was intense. Steve Bannon's War Room, typically a reliable amplifier of Trump's messaging, absolutely erupted with callers who were demanding explanations for how the president could be taking such a stance after spending years telling them that the system was rigged against them. Bannon himself tried to calm the uproar on several podcast episodes, telling his audience that Trump was an imperfect instrument, but urged them to stay focused and not to get worked up over individual comments. MAGA influencers who built their brand on defending Trump were split. Many supported the president, arguing that further reducing H-1B visas would hurt the country competitively and simply result in further outsourcing. Others didn't hold back, wondering aloud whether Silicon Valley donors had captured their populist champion and standard bearer. The coalition fracture went far beyond social media anger too. Several Republicans who'd positioned themselves as defenders of American workers found themselves in an impossible position: defend Trump's comments and risk the populist backlash, or criticize the leader of their party and face potential primary challenges as a result. Most chose silence, and that silence itself spoke volumes. But it hasn't been entirely silence from the right. Younger political thinkers have been far more willing to discuss things once seen as being too controversial, and nowhere has that been more visible than in the rise of Nick Fuentes, a self-described reactionary who built his following among young conservative men who felt the mainstream right had failed them, largely by being too eager to compromise in the name of economic growth, too market-oriented, and too weak on social issues. Even before this year, his star was rising, but it went supernova in a recent interview with Tucker Carlson, in which Fuentes laid out his vision of an America organized far more along racial lines and heaped ample blame on an organized Jewry for undermining national cohesion. Amidst it all, he somehow managed to work in an admiration of Joseph Stalin. Fuentes has claimed victory since it was released, declaring that MAGA is dead and called Trump a scam artist for his various promises that he has not delivered on. But more relevantly, he pointed to something harder to dismiss. Positions that had gotten him banned from social media just a few years earlier were now being echoed by far more mainstream conservative figures. Matt Walsh, one of the more prominent voices at the Daily Wire, tweeted that, quote, "New York is a third world city now. This is mass migration working exactly as intended," end quote. Perhaps no figure illustrated the shift better than Nayland Haley, the 24-year-old son of Nikki Haley, who ran against Trump during the 2024 Republican primary and had spent much of her career arguing that legal immigration strengthened America. Nayland was largely off the radar until late this year, when he suddenly went viral. In a Fox News interview, he came out arguing against H-1B visas, arguing that young Americans were being shut out of jobs that foreign workers were filling for lower wages, quoting, "We are seeing kids graduate with 6 figures in debt and not having a job to show for it. My main friend group graduated with great degrees from great schools. It's been a year and a half since graduation. Not one of them has a job," end quote. For Republicans, this presents a genuine dilemma with no easy solution. The party's donor class and business wing still depends on immigration labor, and bringing in the best and brightest from abroad genuinely is a major boost for high-value industries. But the populist energy that now drives the GOP base increasingly sees those same workers as competition, especially when they're being used to fill more entry-level jobs. And unlike tariffs, where the ramifications are less of a personal issue, immigration is the kind of subject where the divisions on both sides are felt viscerally, making them increasingly impossible to finesse. Epstein. Now, all of those rifts have been taking their toll on the unity that Trump has long enjoyed in his party, but nothing has come to electrify his base quite like Jeffrey Epstein. Variously described as the thinking man's QAnon, the Epstein conspiracy really does have it all. A secret private island, government cover-up, suspicious suicides, even alleged foreign intervention to blackmail government officials. If all of that sounds like a conspiracy theory, well, we can't blame you, but the fact remains that there clearly was something odd going on around the Epstein case. Something so odd that most ordinary voters could sense a rottenness to it. A rottenness Trump's team used during the Biden era to try and leverage their man back into power. During the 2023 to 2024 campaign, top allies, including Kash Patel and Dan Bongino, spent months trying to hype an alleged client list that would expose the deep state's darkest secrets. When asked directly, Trump expressed openness to releasing the Epstein files, but hedged, saying there was a lot of phony stuff mixed in. He would later go on to say that those in his own base who continued to push for this to be released were, quote, weaklings. By the time that Trump took office, though, his base were convinced that he was going to release the files and blow the scandal wide open, hope for hand by members of the administration teasing the public about it for months. In February, Attorney General Pam Bondi announced, quote, the Epstein files, Phase 1, would be coming, and that his client list was on her desk. Yet after that release, it was immediately clear that this wasn't the bombshell people had been expecting. Far from it, in fact. Most of the Phase 1 documents consisted of previously released flight logs and court filings with no major new revelations. Republicans began to express their frustration over the way Bondi had presented this as if it was going to be some sort of earth-shattering moment. Former Fox News host Megyn Kelly described the rollout as a disaster that humiliated the influencers who'd been going to bat for the administration over the issue, later adding that Bondi's days are numbered if she kept overpromising and underdelivering. She wasn't alone either. One of the few things that Trump's coalition can agree on is that Bondi's handling of this has been a mess with no discernible benefit for anyone or strategy behind it. And she didn't stop there, though. On March the 3rd, Bondi claimed that a truckload of evidence had been delivered from the FBI's New York location to headquarters, promising imminent revelations. A little over a week later, she was still insisting that revelations were coming, but had nothing to show for it. After this, the DOJ largely went silent on the issue entirely, though that silence was broken by none other than Elon Musk, who in the midst of a very public falling out with Trump over spending legislation posted that Trump is, quote, in the Epstein files, and that this was the, quoting again, real reason that they had not been made public. He later deleted the tweet and apologized, saying that he went too far, but the damage was done and the pressure to release was now only going to grow. Those who sought more transparency hoped that later phases of the document release would have more details, but they were left disappointed when in July the DOJ issued a memo that essentially closed the case, concluding that there simply was no client list as Bondi had implied, and there was no basis to charge any additional parties with wrongdoing, and that all the other documentation on the case was intertwined with personal victim information, so, quote, no further disclosure would be appropriate or warranted. Case closed? Well, hardly. By this point, the case had gone full circle, well beyond the realm of conspiracy theories. The Democrats' official X account was unapologetic, posting, "Don't let them off the hook. The Epstein files must be released." What had originated as a conspiracy theory was, by this point, mainstream, and the only establishment politician who seemed vested in making sure there wouldn't be further releases was Donald Trump. Polling showed that just shy of 90% of Americans supported at least partial release of the Epstein files, with 3/4 wanting everything released, with victim names redacted. And the timing didn't help either. It was in this same month that the Wall Street Journal broke a major story that Bondi had briefed Trump that his name appeared in the DOJ files, and shortly after that briefing, the administration's willingness for transparency, it evaporated. Now look, to be clear, at the time of writing, the documents have not been fully released, and we don't know what's going to be in them. We also want to emphasize how well connected Jeffrey Epstein was. He was a businessman in his day-to-day life, in regular contact with countless politicians and influential people across the United States and beyond. Having one's name appear in the files is not necessarily an indication of guilt. It was against this backdrop that Congress worked up the courage to act, first among Democrat members, led by Representative Jamie Raskin and 15 of his colleagues. They quickly gained some Republican support, despite the clear hesitancy from the administration, putting the entire congressional caucus in a bind. Voting against transparency on this meant appearing to protect a convicted sex offender's deeds and network, including, potentially, their own president. Voting for it meant defying Trump and facing his wrath. The thing that made the difference was the fact that so much of Trump's own base had been tied into this narrative for years. Only 4 representatives actually signed the discharge petition, with Democrats Thomas Massie of Kentucky, Lauren Boebert of Colorado, Nancy Mace of South Carolina, and Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia. But their willingness to buck the president gave a green light to MAGA's die-hard base that this was an extraordinary situation in which dissent was allowed. The months of stagnation under Attorney General Bondi had already contributed to this pressure. By now, many were clear that the release of the Epstein files would be the hill they were willing to die on. A mere hour or two before the petition reached 218 signatures, the magic number to be a majority in the House, which would override the Speaker and force a floor vote, several key officials, including Bondi, Deputy AG Todd Blanche, and FBI Director Kash Patel, summoned Representative Boebert to the White House, where they met with her in the Situation Room, an area typically reserved for national security briefings and crises. Trump himself was busy phoning Nancy Mace, trying to talk her out of supporting the bill. The interventions all failed. All 4 Republicans held firm, and when newly sworn-in Democratic Representative Adelita Grijalva from Arizona added her name as the 218th signature, the vote was locked in. After months of stalling and dismissing the attempt as a Democrat hoax, Trump ultimately reversed course at the last minute and instructed Republicans to support the bill while insisting he had, quote, nothing to hide. The reversal couldn't paper over the damage already done, though. Trump's base had watched him promise transparency and basically dance around it, even as his own attorney general was fueling the flames, hyping the base up to expect bombshells in the files that never seemed to materialize. For a movement built on exposing establishment corruption, watching their leader potentially protect that same group of people created a rift that no amount of spin could resolve. Now, whatever may come of the release of the Epstein files, it is clear at this point that cracks are forming throughout the movement that Trump built and presided over with impressive unity over the last decade. On the Epstein case itself, Trump very well may end up taking more blame for things than he would have otherwise liked to. If so, he is a victim of his own success here. A decade ago, his controversies around the case were largely considered to be fringe conspiracy theories that weren't taken seriously outside of online circles. Trump helped mainstream those theories, spending years promoting the concept of the deep state operating in the shadows, done for his own benefit at the time, so that he could present himself as the outsider and good guy who was fighting against it all. And that worked against his opponents, but it created expectations among his strongest supporters. Expectations Trump blew up, fighting the release of the files until backed into a corner by Congress. Democrats, for their part, aren't coming out looking much better. While their concerns about government transparency are worthy of pursuing, this has to be seen as a rather last-minute deathbed conversion. The current DOJ files were compiled during a federal case dating back to 2019, and the conviction of Epstein's key accomplice took place in 2021, during which time the Biden administration sat on these files for years without pushing for any transparency. The sudden reversal, given the change in who occupies the Oval Office, is hardly a coincidence. Given the multi-year bipartisan screw-ups on the issue, the recent saga would carry far less weight if it had not been for all of the other issues discussed here. Trump is no stranger to controversies, and his friendship with Epstein isn't exactly a new discovery, but the pressures driving Trump's coalition apart are now far more multifaceted and seem to be growing rather than shrinking as the economy has continued to soften over the last year. In good times, with a growing economy, rising wages, and low inflation, voters were fundamentally less radical, doubtlessly a core component to Trump's coalition's success, even if there was occasional infighting. Particularly on the issue of legal immigration, this dynamic was crucial. Concerns about competition for jobs just don't carry the same weight when opportunities are abundant. Trump's challenge in his second term is that he's facing a very different economic situation while trying to maintain a coalition that was built a decade ago. The earlier playbook assumed a context in which there were enough wins to distribute across different factions. In other words, a rising tide that lifted all ships. The 2025 reality is quite different. Jobs in the US are growing scarce, and the economy outside of certain hyper-focused industries, namely tech, hasn't been experiencing much growth to speak of. The middle class, in other words, is tapping out. In this dynamic, legal immigrants are increasingly being seen as replacements in certain segments of the electorate rather than reinforcements. So when a big controversy like the Epstein files comes on top of all the other stuff, well, you can see how it might put just enough pressure on those cracks to break the coalition apart. The question now is whether the MAGA movement will be able to hold together, whether this populist uprising that overturned American politics will recover its poise and march on into the future, or whether the various factions may descend into civil war. The only thing for certain is that we'll soon find out. Thank you for watching.